She walked out of her house and said she would be staying with friends. That was it. No dramatic goodbye. No visible fear. No sign that her life was about to end. 4 days later, her car would be found abandoned near a pub. Soon after that, her belongings would turn up in the woods. Then her phone would begin sending messages from far away, trying to convince everyone that she was still alive. But the person behind those messages had made one fatal mistake. He could move her phone, he could fake distance, he could create a trail, but he could not truly fake her voice. Today we are in Richmond, North Yorkshire, a place of wide skies, stone buildings, green hills, and quiet roads. The kind of town where people know each other. The kind of town where routines matter. The kind of town where, when a young woman suddenly stops showing up, people notice. And that matters in this case, because Jenny Nicholl did not disappear from a giant city where anonymity can swallow people whole. She vanished from a place where her life had shape. A place where she had work, family, friends, habits, music, and people who expected to see her again. Jenny Nicholl was 19 years old. She lived with her parents, Anne and Brian Nicholl, in Richmond. She worked at the local co-op. She played guitar in pub bands. And by all accounts, music was not some side hobby in her life. It was part of who she was. She moved through a local world of work shifts, pubs, friends, rehearsals, countryside, and nights out in a town small enough for faces to become familiar and absences to become obvious. That image matters, because when people hear the word missing, they sometimes imagine someone already halfway detached from their old life. That was not Jenny. Jenny had a life in motion. She had somewhere to be. People were expecting her. She had shifts at work. She had social plans. She had routines. And when those routines broke, the break was immediate and alarming. This was not a young woman quietly fading out of one life and into another. This was a young woman whose life seemed to stop in the middle of itself. On the evening of June 30th, 2005, Jenny left home at around 6 p.m. She told her parents she would be out that night. That was not unusual. She was 19. She sometimes stayed out. She sometimes spent time with friends. And from what she took with her, it appeared she might be going camping, something that fit naturally with the kind of life she lived. That was the last confirmed sighting of Jenny Nicholl alive. And at that point, there was still no reason for anyone to believe they were standing at the edge of a murder case. To her parents, it was one more summer evening. To the people around her, it was one more ordinary departure. But that ordinary departure would become the center point of everything that followed. Because from that moment on, every question in the case would point back to the same thing. Who did Jenny meet that night? Who knew where she was going? And who had a reason to make sure she never came back? At first, there was still room for simple explanations. Maybe she had gone away with friends. Maybe she was somewhere with no signal. Maybe she had changed plans. Maybe she would walk back through the door and explain everything. But then the silence started to harden. She did not contact home. She did not return. She did not show up where she was expected. And when a person's ordinary life is built on enough small routines, silence itself becomes evidence that something is wrong. By July 4th, Jenny was officially reported missing. And that same day, another crucial piece fell into place. Her white Rover 214i was found parked at the Holly Hill Inn in Richmond. Abandoned, waiting, empty. That car mattered immediately, because it suggested interruption, not escape. If Jenny had truly chosen to vanish, there were usually things police expect to see: withdrawn cash, travel arrangements, some sign of planning, some sign that a person is actively building distance. But that is not what this looked like. Her car was still local, still close to home, still inside the geography of her normal life. It did not look like the first step of a clean, voluntary disappearance. It looked like something had stopped her life before it could keep moving. Once the Rover was found, police intensified the search. Officers appealed to the public. They began tracing her movements. They looked at where she might have gone, who she might have seen, and whether she had made any preparations at all to leave on her own. And the deeper they looked, the worse that theory became. There was no sign of her organizing a new life. No meaningful banking activity suggesting she was starting over somewhere else. No practical trail that pointed to a voluntary disappearance. Instead, investigators were left with a young woman gone without explanation, a car left behind, and a town slowly realizing that this was no longer just worrying. It was dangerous. Then another deeply unsettling development appeared. Searches and family efforts began drawing attention to Sandbeck Plantation. That area would become one of the most important landscapes in the entire case, because over time, Jenny's belongings would be found there. Public reporting on the case later tied Sandbeck to the discovery of personal items, including Jenny's teddy bear and her portable music player. Not just random objects, not just debris in the woods, but recognizable pieces of her life, human pieces, intimate pieces, the kind of things that turn woodland into evidence and evidence into heartbreak. And Sandbeck Plantation mattered for another reason. It was linked to David Hodgson. He and his brother Robert had connections to rough shelters in that area. Those huts would become central later, because this case was never built on one dramatic discovery. It was built the way some of the strongest circumstantial cases are built. One pattern, then another, until coincidence stops feeling possible. The deeper police dug into Jenny's private life, the darker the case became. Because they discovered that Jenny had been involved in a secret relationship with David Hodgson. David was around 45 at the time Jenny disappeared. He was married. He had children. And according to reporting around the case, he had been grooming Jenny since she was about 14 years old. That detail changes everything, because now this was no longer just a mystery about a missing 19-year-old. Now it was a case involving a much older man, a hidden relationship, and a long pattern of inappropriate access to a teenage girl's life. David tried to minimize and reshape that relationship. At different times, he denied it, then acknowledged it, then tried to narrow it. He claimed the sexual part of the relationship had not begun until she was older. He tried to make it sound limited, contained, past tense. But for investigators, the issue was no longer whether this relationship had existed. It clearly had. The real question was what that relationship had become by the summer of 2005, and what happened when Jenny began moving beyond it. That moving beyond it is crucial, because one of the central prosecution theories was jealousy. Not abstract jealousy, not vague emotional tension. Specific jealousy. Jealousy involving David's own brother, Robert Hodgson. In the weeks before Jenny disappeared, it emerged that she had also begun seeing Robert. That created a new emotional fault line in the case. Jenny was no longer standing still inside David's world. She was shifting, possibly pulling away, possibly redirecting her attention. And for a possessive man who had already inserted himself into her life for years, that shift may have been intolerable. This is where the case stops looking like a random disappearance and starts looking like control. Because if the prosecution was right, David Hodgson did not simply lose Jenny. He lost his ability to control the terms of her life. And the Crown's theory was that he responded to that loss in the most extreme way possible. Then came the messages. And this is the part of the case that made it unforgettable. After Jenny vanished, her mobile phone suddenly came back to life. Texts were sent to friends and family. They claimed she was fine. They claimed she was away. They suggested she was camping. Later, they suggested she was in Scotland. The overall message was clear. Stop worrying. Stop looking. Jenny is alive. Jenny left by choice. At first, those messages created hope. And hope can be cruel in cases like this. Because hope makes families follow bad maps. It makes them believe in false distances. It makes them imagine that silence has an explanation. Jenny's mother, Anne, followed up on those messages. She searched where the phone activity seemed to point, but Jenny was not there. Investigators also started noticing something else. The messages were not just suspicious because of where they were sent from. They were suspicious because they did not sound like Jenny. The tone was off. The wording was off. The rhythm was off. At an emotional level, family and police already sensed that. But this case would not rest on instinct alone. It would go much further than that. The phone activity showed texts being sent from places far from Richmond, including Carlisle and Jedburgh. That was important because those places helped create the illusion that Jenny had traveled north and started putting distance between herself and home. It was a smart lie. Or at least it looked smart at first. Because if police believed Jenny was moving between those areas, their focus would scatter. The family might calm down. The timeline would blur. And the suspect pool would widen away from the small circle of people close to her in Richmond. But the false trail had a weakness. Actually, it had two weaknesses. The first was language. The second was mileage. Let's start with language. One of the most important developments in the entire case was forensic linguistic analysis. Specialists compared messages known to have been written by Jenny with messages known to have been written by David Hodgson, and with the disputed texts sent from Jenny's phone after she disappeared. The result was devastating. The disputed messages were found to be stylistically closer to David Hodgson than to Jenny Nicholl. That may sound technical, but in plain English it means this. The killer, or the person sending those texts, could imitate the idea of Jenny, but he could not truly imitate the way Jenny wrote, and that became one of the most powerful pieces of the prosecution case. The analysis focused on the tiny habits people build into writing without realizing it. Spacing, contractions, how they shorten words, how they misspell words, how they structure a sentence when they are not thinking about it. Those unconscious habits are often more revealing than the message itself. And according to published discussion of the case by forensic linguistics experts, texts known to be written by Jenny clustered together stylistically, while the disputed messages aligned more closely with David's language patterns. That mattered so much because these were not long emails or handwritten pages. They were text messages, short, casual, seemingly disposable. And yet those short messages carried enough linguistic fingerprinting to help convict a killer in a case with no body. And that is one reason this case is still discussed in the context of forensic linguistics today. Then there was the mileage. At trial, prosecutors showed that David Hodgson had rented a car on the dates that aligned with the false messages being sent from Carlisle and Jedburgh. And the recorded mileage on that rental car fit the round trips from Richmond to those exact areas. That turned the texts from suspicious into structured, because now police were no longer just saying somebody used Jenny's phone to create distance. They were saying David Hodgson physically traveled to create that distance. Think about what that means. This was not panic. This was not one bad lie told in the heat of the moment. This was effort, planning, time, driving, cover-up. A person who was trying to manufacture survival after death. A person who wanted the family to believe Jenny had chosen to leave. A person who wanted police chasing movement instead of a murder. And that is what makes this case so chilling. Because the cover-up was not passive, it was active, it was geographic, it was linguistic, it was deliberate. Jenny's killer, according to the prosecution theory the jury accepted, did not just remove her from the world. He tried to keep speaking in her place after she was gone. Meanwhile, searches continued. Police combed the countryside. They searched woodland. They searched remote areas. They searched multiple locations over a long period of time. North Yorkshire police later recorded that Jenny's body has still never been found. That fact sits at the center of the case, even now. Because this was, and remains, a no-body murder conviction. And that made the prosecution's job extraordinarily difficult. No body, no confirmed murder scene, no final resting place, no ability to stand in court and point to the place where everything happened. Instead, prosecutors had to prove murder through accumulation. Relationship, motive, false texts, travel records, forensic linguistics, physical items, DNA links to locations David denied taking Jenny to. That DNA evidence was another major blow to David's denials. At trial, he denied taking Jenny to the huts hidden in Sandbeck Plantation. But evidence contradicted him. And the discovery of Jenny's belongings in that same area only deepened the significance of the plantation in the overall case. By the time the Crown formally charged David Hodgson in May 2007, the case they were building was already clear in structure. Jenny had not left voluntarily. David had a hidden, inappropriate, long-running relationship with her. Jenny had recently become involved with Robert Hodgson. David had reason to be jealous. False texts were sent after Jenny vanished. Those texts did not read like Jenny. They read more like David. And David's rental car movements matched the distances needed to send those texts from far away. When the trial began in early 2008, the Crown's challenge was not simply to tell a compelling story. It was to make the absence itself persuasive. To show that the body's absence was not reasonable doubt, it was part of the crime, part of the concealment, part of the cruelty. The defense, naturally, attacked uncertainty. Because in a no-body case, uncertainty is always the battlefield. If the defense can make a jury feel that too much is missing, too much is inferred, too much is indirect, then the entire structure can wobble. And that is why this conviction mattered so much. Because the prosecution did not need one spectacular piece of evidence. It needed the jury to understand that every major line in the case pointed in the same direction. The jury heard that Jenny had been secretly involved with David. They heard that she had grown closer to his brother. They heard about the messages that appeared after she vanished. They heard that those messages did not sound like her. They heard about the car rental and the mileage. They heard about Sandbeck Plantation. And in February 2008, after hearing that body of evidence, the jury convicted David Hodgson of Jenny Nicholl's murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 18 years. And North Yorkshire police later stated publicly that although Jenny's body had never been discovered, the murder had been solved and Hodgson had been jailed. But for Jenny's family, conviction was not the end of suffering. Because there is a particular kind of cruelty in a case like this. A person can be found guilty. A judge can sentence him. The public can hear the word justice. And still, the family cannot bury their child. That is what happened here. David Hodgson never revealed where Jenny's remains were left. He never gave her parents the chance to bring her home. He never gave them a grave they chose. He never gave them the truth in its final form. In November 2009, a coroner formally recorded that Jenny was dead and that her death was an unlawful killing. Even then, authorities and family members continued appealing for information about where she had been left. But the silence held. Years passed. The case did not disappear. Because cases like this never really do. They remain open in a different emotional sense. Not because guilt is unresolved, but because grief is. In 2015, North Yorkshire police stated publicly that the case remained open in the sense that they still hoped Jenny's remains could one day be found and returned to her parents. That continued silence around the location of victims' remains would eventually become part of a much larger legal movement in the UK. Jenny's case became one of the cases associated with support for what became known as Helen's Law. That law was designed so that when a killer refuses to reveal the location of a victim's remains, that refusal must be considered by the parole board when release is being assessed. That matters, because refusing to reveal a body is not a passive act. It is not a harmless omission. It is an extension of control, an extension of punishment, an extension of power over a family already devastated by murder. In 2019, ITV reported that Jenny Nicholl's parents welcomed the proposed parole law change, saying they were delighted that killers who refuse to disclose where their victims are could be denied parole. And official government guidance now confirms that the Prisoners' Disclosure of Information about Victims, Act 2020, came into force on January 4, 2021, placing a statutory duty on the parole board to consider such non-disclosure in relevant cases. For Jenny's family, that law could not undo what happened in 2005. It could not give them back the years. It could not restore the daughter they lost. But it did acknowledge something essential. That withholding a body is part of the harm. That silence can be cruelty. That denial can be violence extended through time. And when you step back and look at the whole case, that is exactly what makes Jenny Nicholl's story so devastating. This is not just the story of a missing girl. It is the story of a young woman with music in her life, a job in her town, friends around her, family waiting for her, and a future that should have kept unfolding. It is the story of a hidden relationship that began in imbalance and control. It is the story of jealousy when she moved beyond that control. It is the story of a killer trying to keep talking through her phone after she was gone. And it is the story of how that lie, in the end, helped convict him. Because that is the haunting irony at the center of this case. David Hodgson tried to create distance. He tried to create movement. He tried to create the illusion that Jenny was still alive, still traveling, still writing, still choosing. But every mile he drove, every message he sent, every word he put into her mouth pulled the case closer to him. He could hide her body. He could not hide pattern. He could hide location. He could not hide authorship. He could build a false trail. He could not build a true voice. And that is why Jenny Nicholl's case still matters. Because it proved something powerful. Even when a killer removes the body, even when he tries to erase the scene, even when he turns the victim's own phone into a weapon of deception, truth can still survive in the fragments, in the mileage, in the woods, in the objects left behind, and in this case, in the words. Jenny mattered. She mattered before the investigation. She mattered before the trial. She mattered before her case helped shape wider conversations about parole and disclosure. She was not just evidence in a landmark conviction. She was a daughter, a musician, a young woman whose life should have kept moving forward. And maybe the most painful part of all is this. For all the sophistication in the case, for all the analysis, for all the police work, for all the legal history that followed, the one thing her family still does not have is Jenny. Not her remains, not a grave chosen in love, not the final act of bringing her home. So when people remember this case, they should remember more than the fake texts, more than the forensic linguistics, more than the nobody conviction. They should remember the girl at the center of it, the 19-year-old who left home one summer evening and should have come back. The girl with music in her life. The girl whose future was stolen. The girl whose killer tried to erase her by speaking in her name, and failed. Because in the end, the lie was not strong enough, the silence was not clean enough, and the cover story was not careful enough to bury the truth forever. Thank you to everyone who watched this video. We truly hope this story mattered to you. And if you'd like to support the channel and help us continue creating content, please like the video, leave a comment, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support really makes a difference, and we genuinely appreciate every person who helps keep these stories from being forgotten.